and then we'll have the discussion afterwards.
We are now live on YouTube. I'll send you the link.
We are now live on YouTube, and we are being recorded. So I'm very happy to welcome you all here to the Princeton-Bucharest virtual seminar. And today's session is about parallel influences, ancient Greek geometry in the PortRoyal Logic and Spinoza's Ethics. And I guess we're going to begin with Spinoza's Ethics and Raffi Krut-Landau, University of Pennsylvania, who will be speaking first. So Raffi, why don't you begin?
Thank you so much, Dan. And I wanted to thank Donna Gelobianu and Claudia Dumitru and anybody else who's been involved in organizing this. Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this. It's also, let me say, such a great pleasure to see, a huge pleasure to see friends and colleagues here, and even people who I've only met through Zoom, new friends. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to our session. And thank you above all to Laura, my co-panelist, for doing this with me, even though it is 5:30 a.m. in Sydney where she is. My name is Raphael Krut-Landau. I'm coming to you from Ontario. And our session is called Parallel Influences, Ancient Greek Geometry in the PortRoyal Logic and Spinoza's Ethics. Some of the richest and most interesting ideas about geometry and the philosophy of geometry come down to us from the ancient Mediterranean world. And in this session, we're going to talk about the underappreciated influence of ancient geometrical thought on early modern philosophy. Focusing on the PortRoyal Logic and Spinoza's Ethics, we hope to show you that ancient ideas about geometry inspired a surprisingly wide range of philosophical insights. For example, insights about how to reason well and how to live forever. So I will give you my talk first, which will be about Spinoza's Ethics, and it's called Hidden Figures, Potentiality and Geometry in Spinoza. So the story I want to tell begins in ancient Greece. In Book 9 of the Metaphysics, Aristotle says that west of Athens, in the city-state of Megara, enemies to the Athenians, the philosophers over there believe that everything that is possible is already actual. There are, for the Megarans, no unactualized possibilities. In Aristotle's words, there are some who say, as the Megarians do, that a thing can act only when it is acting. And when it is not acting, it can't act. So someone who is not building cannot build, but only he who is building, and only when he is building. And Aristotle says it's not hard to see the absurdities that attend this view. And he argues that among other problems, the Megarians can't explain how things can change. How else could we explain change other than as a process in which something that is merely possible becomes actual? So if you think that everything possible is already actual, then you're going to have a lot of trouble explaining how anything can change. Now, Aristotle tried his darndest to defeat this Megarian view in the Metaphysics, but it's widely believed that Aristotle did not succeed. It is widely believed that the Megarian view had a champion in the 17th century, namely Benedict de Spinoza. So there's an orthodox interpretation of Spinoza's metaphysics, according to which Spinoza's world contains no unactualized potentialities. One commentator who's given an especially clear expression to this view is Valtteri Viljanen. And in his excellent book, Spinoza's Geometry of Power, he puts it this way: Spinoza discards the Aristotelian doctrine of activity as actualization of potentiality. There is no potentiality in Spinoza's system. All finite power is always fully in use. Everything is already doing everything it possibly can. So you may think that there are potentialities within you, that you could go and live another life or learn a new language. And on this reading of Spinoza, Spinoza would say, there are no potentialities in you that have not already been actualized. As Viljanen puts it, in God or nature, these being two names for the same thing, There is no power except actual power. And this reading of Spinoza's metaphysics has implications far beyond simply Spinoza's ontological views. So in a book that came out last year, Sandra Field argues that for Spinoza, unlike the scholastics, all power is fully actualized. Each individual has precisely the degree of power that it displays. And as you can imagine, this gives rise to a very interesting approach to politics. If people, if political actors and groups of actors have no more potentiality than they are already displaying in their actions, then this leads to fascinating theories of, for example, will and agency. This interpretation of Spinoza is by no means confined just to these recent thinkers. You can find it as far back as Deleuze, and a number of other commentators, Martin Lin, Francesca de Papa as well, have given expression to this interpretation. So why does anybody hold this view of Spinoza? There is a passage in the Ethics which prima facie very strongly supports this interpretation. And it is a scholium that we find in part 1 of the Ethics, where Spinoza says, "From God's supreme power, everything follows. By the same necessity, and in the same way as from the nature of a triangle, it follows eternally that its angles are equal to 2 right angles." Right? So just as a triangle can't help it that its angles add up to 2 right angles, so too God, given his nature, can't help creating you just as you are. And that means that you couldn't be anything more than you already are. And Spinoza puts it this way: God's infinite power, his omnipotence, has been actual from eternity and will remain in the same actuality to eternity. Now, I've called this view the Orthodox view, which is usually code in history of philosophy for the wrong view. However, I'm not going to argue that this view is wrong. But what I would like to do is reassess this orthodoxy. It's become very central. And according to this interpretation, Spinoza, departing from an Aristotelian scholastic tradition, does away with unactualized potentiality. There's just absolutely no room in Spinoza's ontology for unactualized potentiality according to this common view. And what I want to do today is reassess this standard view in light of some ancient ideas about geometry that I think make themselves felt in the Ethics. So since we're going to go back to the ancient world and we're going to look at some ancient theories of geometry, what I'd like to do as a warm-up is to take you through 3 examples of propositions from Euclid. These are just delightful little examples of Euclidean geometry, and they're relatively simple. So the very first proposition of Euclid's elements is this: the task is to construct an equilateral triangle given a short line like this. So how do you do it? Well, you first treat this line as the radius of a circle which you draw. You then treat the same line as the radius of another circle which you draw. And you see that those 2 circles intersect at the top. And so you draw a line up to the point of intersection. And then you draw another line down from the point of intersection to the beginning of the line that you started with, and you have an equilateral triangle. And you know that it's equilateral because the sides of the triangle are all equal to a radius of one of these 2 circles, and you know that the circles are the same. The circles are the same, the radiuses are the same, and therefore the sides of the triangle are equal in length. Let me give you another example of a piece of Euclidean geometry. So this is from a little bit later in book 1 of Euclid's Elements. And here Euclid wants to show that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 2 right angles. So how can you see this? He thinks you can modify this drawing in such a way as to make it quite evident that the angles of a triangle add up to 2 right angles. So how do you do that? Well, you extend the base over a little bit. And you'll see that there's a side of the triangle on the left, and he says, construct a line parallel to that side. So now we have 2 diagonal lines that are parallel to one another. And now you're in a position to see that the angles of a triangle sum to 2 right angles. So for example, you can see that these 2 angles are the same because they are created by 2 parallel lines and a line that cuts across them. You can see that these 2 angles that I've colored in yellow are the same because, again, they're made by 2 parallel lines and a line that cuts across them. And then, of course, this 3rd angle is simply the 3rd angle in the triangle. So you can now see that the red yellow and blue angles in the triangle, when you put them side by side, must sum to 2 right angles. Let me give you another example of some Euclidean geometry. In book 3 of the Elements, Euclid says that you can use this circle to construct infinitely many pairs of equal area rectangles. How do you do that? Well, you first draw 2 intersecting lines inside the circle. You then effectively bend each line at the point of intersection, forming an L shape. So here I've bent this first chord into an L, and you finish that off into a rectangle. Then you do the same thing with the other chord, bend into an L, and finish it off into a rectangle. And these rectangles are guaranteed to have the same area. And what's magical is that no matter what chords you begin with, the rectangles you end up with are going to have the same area. Okay, with all this in mind, I'd like to now turn to Aristotle's philosophy of geometry. And this is an aspect of Aristotle's thought that hasn't gotten a lot of press and attention, even within Aristotle studies, and certainly outside of Aristotle studies. And so I think it's quite exciting to explore. And one of the main ideas in Aristotle's philosophy of geometry is that when you draw a shape, you actualize it. And this is a point he makes in the Metaphysics in book 9. And this is said very clearly in one of Aristotle's early modern commentators. So Blancanus in 1615 offers the following clarification of Aristotle's view. He says, consider that triangle from Euclid, right? The one where you begin with a triangle and then you extend the base and you add another line parallel to one of the sides of the triangle, the second of the 3 examples I gave you. Blancanus says that according to Aristotle, if line CD, which exists potentially, is brought to actuality, it'll soon be clear to anybody looking that this triangle's angles add to 2 right angles. So, and this is a fairly standard, and it's not surprising interpretation of Aristotle. For Aristotle, when you draw a line, you are actualizing something that exists potentially. That line CD, it was already there somehow, even before you drew it. It exists potentially. You then, by drawing it, bring it to actuality, and that enables you to see the truth of this geometrical theorem. But this raises an important question. How does Aristotle think about actualization? And to answer this question, we've got to take a look at the Dionyma, where Aristotle gives one of his most detailed accounts of how actualization works in general. So in the Dionyma, as students of Aristotle know well, he says that a piece of knowledge can exist in 3 ways. That is to say, it can pass through 3 different phases on the route from potentiality to full actuality. So let me give you an example. Suppose you want to learn how to say the word yes in French. To begin with, you don't know how to say this word in French, but you're a human being, you're not a toaster, right? You're not a snowball, right? You have a brain, you have the capacity to acquire this piece of knowledge. And Aristotle would say that this piece of knowledge already exists in you as a potentiality. Then you go out and take some French lessons, and you take this piece of knowledge to a higher degree of actuality. And I want to stress that readers of Aristotle, at least since the Middle Ages, have labeled this first stage of actualization first potentiality. So we could say, for example, that this piece of knowledge exists in you as a first potentiality, which is just to say that it's something that you could possibly acquire. In the next step, you've gone out and you've acquired this piece of knowledge, and it exists in you. But it hasn't yet been fully actualized because you're not yet using it. So when the knowledge is simply in your head, but you're not putting it into action, then it is partly actualized. And Aristotelians call this step first actuality. Finally, when you use the knowledge, you've brought it to a higher degree of actuality, and this step is called second actuality. So to summarize, I know this is a busy diagram, to summarize Aristotle's view of actualization, we can put it in one sentence, right? This piece of knowledge first is absent, but possible. Then it's present, but latent. So it's partly actual. And then it's fully manifest. And so Aristotle distinguishes between 2 kinds of actuality here. Okay, now that we've seen Aristotle's general account of actualization, how does he apply this account to geometrical construction? Now, unfortunately, to my knowledge, he does not explicitly do so. So we've got to speculate. We've got to consider, given his general account of actualization, what is Aristotle's likely view about what happens when you're doing a geometrical construction? And although this is speculative, I think it's pretty straightforward. So let's take, for example, the third piece of Euclidean geometry I mentioned earlier, constructing equal area rectangles from a circle. So what happens metaphysically when you construct these rectangles? Well, you start out with a circle, and then you construct the rectangles. You draw them using this technique, right? So the question I now want to raise is, what is Aristotle's likely theory of the metaphysics of this process? In other words, how can we apply Aristotle's theory of actualization to geometrical construction? And I think it's not hard to guess what it might be. So to begin with, suppose you're constructing the two rectangles shown on the slide here. What's the first thing that you would do? Well, you'd go get a piece of paper or something else to draw on. And at this stage of the process of constructing these rectangles, the rectangles exist as mere potentialities. They're simply something that could exist. They're simply something that could be drawn on this piece of paper. So for Aristotle, the rectangles already exist in a certain sense. They exist as mere potentialities. They're absent, but they're possible. And then that is a kind of existence. That's what Aristotle calls first potentiality. But then you draw the circle. And this is an important step on the road to constructing these two rectangles. After all, if you drew a much larger or much smaller circle, then you would not be able to construct these rectangles in particular. So when you select this circle, that is an important step on the road to constructing those two rectangles in particular. And so what I want to suggest is that at this point, the rectangles now exist latently in the circle. They're dormant, right? They're waiting to be actualized. They've been brought a little closer to actuality than they were previously, just by drawing the circle. You've given yourself a medium through which these rectangles can be constructed. And finally, when you actually go ahead and construct the rectangles, then they exist at the highest level of actuality. They exist at the level of second actuality. If all of that went too quickly, let me give you a quick summary. For Aristotle, first the rectangles are absent but possible, then they are present but latent, and finally they're fully manifest. And he labels these three phases of actualization: first potentiality, first actuality, and second actuality. With all this in mind now, I want to turn to Spinoza's ethics, and I think that some of these ideas can help clarify Spinoza's own view of geometrical construction and actualization. So in part 2 of the Ethics, Spinoza makes a very important distinction between two kinds of existence: eternal existence and duration. And it's a convoluted passage, and so I'm going to give you a paraphrase of it to keep things simple here. But I'd be very glad to go and look at the actual original text in the question and answer session if anybody wants to hold my feet to the fire. But here's my paraphrase of what Spinoza says, and this is in Proposition 8, and in its corollary and in the Scholium. He says, look, things can exist in two ways, either eternally or durationally. That is, things can exist eternally or things can last. Things can have a certain duration. This distinction is so important that if you don't grasp it, you're going to be really lost, right? This distinction plays such a crucial role in Spinoza's account of ethics, in his account of beatitude, even in his account of joy. So this is very important. So he says, let me give you an illustration of what I mean. He says, think of a circle. And he says, alluding to Euclid, that a circle is of such a nature that rectangles formed from the segments of intersecting chords are equal to one another. So a circle contains infinitely many pairs of equal area rectangles. So already he's saying that these rectangles are somehow there already, even when you've just drawn the circle. The circle contains these rectangles. And he doubles down on this and insists that the rectangles in a certain sense exist. These rectangles, he says, only exist insofar as the circle exists. So these rectangles have a certain kind of existence that is dependent upon or parasitic upon the existence of the circle. Then he says, now let's construct two of these rectangles. And he uses this Euclidean imperative. Let two of all the many rectangles that could possibly be constructed, let two of them be conceived to exist. And then he says, at this point, we now conceive the rectangles as having an additional kind of existence. So you can see how it is that he's clarifying the difference between eternity and duration. Those are two ways of existing. And he says, it's just like how when you're constructing a rectangle, it has a kind of pre-existence in the circle. And then when you've drawn it, it comes to have another kind of existence. So that gives you a better grasp of the two kinds of existence that he is discussing here. But you might be thinking that this is not yet very clear. So what I want to do is clarify Spinoza's view a little bit more by comparing and contrasting it with Aristotle's view. So let me go back now to Aristotle's Metaphysics of Geometrical Construction. I want to go over what I take his view to be, and then I will ask, what in this picture would Spinoza agree with and disagree with? So for Aristotle, metaphysically speaking, what's happening when you draw a triangle, or what's happening when you construct some rectangles from a circle? Well, as I mentioned, at the beginning of the process, you start out with blank paper, and at this point, the rectangles exist as mere potentialities. Then you draw your circle, and at this point, the rectangles already exist, but they are latent in the circle, and it's just in that sense that they exist. They're dormant, they're waiting in there to be awakened by, as it were, the activity of drawing. And then in the final stage of the process, we've constructed the rectangles, and at this point, they exist in a new way. They exist at the level of second actuality. And remember that Aristotle effectively holds this view. Rectangles are first absent, but possible, then they're present, but latent, and finally, they're fully manifest. And Aristotelians give some labels to these different kinds of existence. The first is called first potentiality. The second is called first actuality. And Aristotle often associates first actuality with form. He says a form is the first actuality of a natural organic body. So at least when it comes to living things, there's a close association with first actuality and form. And I wanted to put that up there on this slide. And finally, the rectangles reach the third stage of this process, second actuality. The question I now want to raise is, what in this picture would Spinoza agree with? Now, according to the Orthodox view, Spinoza would reject this whole picture, right? According to the Orthodox view, as Viljonen and Sandra Field have put it, Spinoza discards the whole Aristotelian stroke scholastic conception of actualization. So there's very little in this picture that Spinoza would agree with. Then again, at least we would probably have to concede that Spinoza accepts part of the picture, namely that he agrees that the rectangles have a certain kind of existence at first when they're latent, and then another kind of existence when they've been constructed. So these correspond to two different kinds of existence. And so he would at least accept this part of the story. And he would accept this part of the story as well, because he agrees, as it says here, that when we draw that circle, the rectangles already have a certain kind of existence. And when we construct them, they gain an additional kind of existence. Now, Spinoza calls that first kind of existence eternal existence, and the second kind of existence duration. Now, if Spinoza agrees with part of the picture, I've just highlighted it and I've stamped it with a picture of Spinoza's head. But what about Aristotle's distinction between two kinds of actuality? Is there anything about that view that Spinoza would find attractive? Well, as it happens, when we read part 5, we find that Spinoza says something that's very reminiscent of Aristotle's distinction between two kinds of actuality. And this is a famous passage, I think very well known to Spinoza scholars. He says, things are conceived by us as actual in two ways. On the one hand, we can conceive of them as spatio-temporal, as existing in relation to a certain time and place. And on the other hand, we can conceive things as eternal, as contained in God. So it does seem to me that Spinoza would at least agree that there are, in fact, two kinds of actuality. One of them corresponds to eternal existence, and the other corresponds to duration. So if we now step back and look at the whole picture, we can see that, in fact, there is quite a lot of this Aristotelian picture of the metaphysics of geometrical construction that Spinoza would absolutely accept, right? He would agree that the rectangles get they first have one kind of actuality when you've drawn the circle, and then they gain another kind of actuality when you draw them. I don't know whether Spinoza would agree that there's such a thing as first potentiality. There are some texts in Spinoza that seem to suggest that he wouldn't posit that first phase of actualization, but at least it does seem to me that he endorses a surprisingly large amount of the traditional Aristotelian account of actualization, and you can see it from how Spinoza addresses the metaphysics of geometrical construction. Finally, we know from parts 2 and 3 that Spinoza associates the first kind of actuality with form. This is a term that he uses a number of times. So is it really the case that Spinoza abandons so much of the Aristotelian model of actualization? I'm not so sure. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that he embraces a lot of that, of the view that was dominant in the period. I would even go so far as to suggest that we're licensed in speaking of Spinozistic first actuality and Spinozistic second actuality. This is not to say that Spinoza simply imports into his metaphysics Aristotle's exact concept of first actuality, but I do think that Spinoza has his own version of what Aristotle calls first and second actuality, and then it's illuminating to consider this. Some of you may be thinking, okay, maybe, maybe not, maybe you're not so convinced. You might be saying, look, is there any clear, robust textual evidence that Spinoza is really embracing an Aristotelian view? After all, isn't Spinoza supposed to be the champion of the anti-Aristotelian new science? Isn't he supposed to be part of the whole movement to which we are currently heir that toppled the Aristotelian hegemony? Does Spinoza even have anything particularly positive to say about scholasticism? Doesn't he occasionally insult it, and so on? So let me give you a different kind of evidence for this view. Now, in fact, I'm not the first person to suggest that Spinoza's relationship with scholasticism is positive. Pietro di Vona and John Carriero have both made this point as well. And both of them have pointed to the preface of part 4 of the Ethics as a part of the Ethics where Spinoza is engaging interestingly with scholasticism. And I agree with them, and I want to offer this example. In scholasticism, there was an enormous amount of attention directed towards the following question. How can we metaphysically explain qualitative change? In other words, I have lots of non-spatial properties, right? I have emotions, I can be in love, I can be angry, and so on. How can we metaphysically explain what happens when these properties increase? How can we explain increases in heat and motion and heaviness and so on? And a specific instance of this question is this. What happens metaphysically speaking when somebody becomes stronger? Well, there are lots of scholastic discussions about this kind of question, books and treatises and book chapters written about it, and it's really one of the central issues in scholasticism. For example, what happens when grace increases in you? This is a very important 12th century or 13th century question. So there are a number of views out there in scholasticism, and two well-known positions are these. One view is endorsed by a number of people, including Avicenna, and it's the view that you pass through a series of forms when you're getting stronger. So first you're instantiating the form of weak strength. Then you instantiate a different form, the form of moderate strength. And finally, you instantiate a third form, the form of great strength. But Aquinas says that this view multiplies too many entities. We can explain what's going on with just one form. There's just the form of strength. And what happens is it's not that that form disappears or changes, but instead when you're getting stronger, your relationship to that form changes. You actualize the form to a greater degree. And at one point, he even puts the following spin on it. You participate in the form to a greater degree. And this is a piece of Platonic sounding language, but Thomas isn't using it in a Platonic way. All he means is that you're actualizing the form to a greater degree, or the form is instantiated in you to a greater degree. Now, in the preface to part 4, Spinoza considers this very question. What happens when somebody gets stronger? Or in Spinoza's lingo, what happens when somebody passes from a lesser to a greater perfection? And he says this, look, when somebody becomes more powerful, in other words, passes to a greater perfection, I do not mean that he has changed from one essence or form to another. Rather, what happens is that we conceive that his power of acting, insofar as it is understood through his nature, is increased. In other words, he participates more in the divine nature. So when you get stronger, you're actualizing more of God's power in your body and mind. That's what's going on. And I think it's clear that Spinoza is operating in a context where he expects that his readers are aware of these scholastic positions, and he's alluding to them. So here, in the first part of this quotation, I think it's fairly clear that he's rejecting the view that Avicenna and many others accepted, the view that when you become more powerful, that you're passing from one form to another. And instead, he's embracing the Thomistic view, which he puts in the following way. We can see that his power of acting is understood more through his nature. In other words, his power of acting more greatly expresses his nature. In other words, he participates more in the divine nature. It's a very Thomistic kind of claim. So, in other words, it would very much appear that not only is Spinoza aware of the Aristotelian model of actualization, not only are there signs from Spinoza's philosophy of geometry that he endorses an Aristotelian model of actualization, but even here in this moment in part 4, he says that he endorses one of the chief ways of understanding Aristotelian actualization. So perhaps our standard picture of Spinoza as abandoning the Aristotelian model does need to be questioned a little bit. So let me give you a summary of what I've argued so far. First, I've argued that Spinoza accepts a metaphysics of geometrical construction that is broadly Aristotelian. It's not exactly Aristotelian. There are many differences, but it is broadly Aristotelian. And I think it's fair to say it's misleading to say that Spinoza discards the potentiality-actuality distinction or that he abandons the Aristotelian model. He has his own version of it. I would even go so far as to suggest that the two kinds of existence that Spinoza distinguishes, eternal and durational existence, are modeled on Aristotle's distinction between first and second actuality. This means the following. For Spinoza, the sort of existence that eternal beings have, essences, the laws of nature, and God, is first actuality. It's his version of what Aristotle had called first actuality. Spinoza uses geometrical construction as a template for thinking about how it is that eternal things get realized in the temporal world. And so, at least from our standpoint, there are lots of things in Spinoza's worldview that are not fully actualized. So for example, before my birth, my essence already existed. The pattern that defines me as me already existed. It just wasn't actualized yet. It was like that, the rectangles existing in the circle that haven't yet been drawn. And after my death, I will return to that form of existence. Right? It's as though, think of what happens when you draw the rectangles and then erase them. Well, the rectangles are still in the circle in a certain sense. Right? They exist potentially in the circle. For Spinoza, in my view, when he says that we are eternal, what he's claiming is that after my death, I will continue to exist as a potentiality in God, but as a first actuality, to be very specific. So let's now return to the passage that supposedly supports the Orthodox position. Right? Spinoza says in part 1, from God's supreme power, everything follows by the same necessity, and in the same way as from the nature of a triangle it follows, from eternity and to eternity, that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. God's omnipotence has then been actual from eternity and will remain in the same actuality to eternity. This remark by Spinoza alludes, I think, to a comment that Aristotle makes in Book 4 of the Metaphysics. There, Aristotle says that there's a certain kind of accident that, in his words, attaches to each thing in virtue of itself, but is not in its substance. In other words, this is a necessary but non-essential property. And the example he gives is the property of a triangle, that its angles add to 2 right angles. And Aristotle says that accidents of this sort may be eternal. And in the physics, he makes clear that he does think that this accident is eternal. So the property of a triangle, that its angles add to 2 right angles, is a classic Aristotelian example of a non-essential, necessary, and eternal property. So it could very well be the case that Spinoza is alluding to Aristotle's metaphysics in this moment, where he says that everything follows from the nature of God. In other words, everything is a necessary, eternal, but not essential property of God. And he likens it to Aristotle's example of such a property. Now, as we've seen, for Aristotle in geometry, constructions actualize. They actualize geometrical properties and relations and shapes. So the properties of a triangle, which can be exhibited in a construction, are actualized in that construction. So before you construct them, they're there, but they're not fully actualized. And so I think Aristotle can plausibly be read as holding the view that a triangle's properties are eternally actual, but not fully actual, right? It wasn't until the Greeks and others started doing geometry that the properties of triangles became fully actual, because they were fully actualized in constructions. But long before the human race existed, these properties were already there. They were eternal, they just weren't yet fully actualized. They exist eternally as first actualities. Given that Spinoza seems so strongly to be alluding to Aristotle in the first part of this quotation, I think there's a possibility that he's also alluding to Aristotle in the next part of the quotation, where he says that God's power has been actual from eternity and will remain in the same actuality to eternity. I think it might just be that when Spinoza says that God remains in the same actuality, what he's saying is that there's a particular type of actuality that God exhibits, namely first actuality. And that would mean that God is not fully actualized, but only actualized to the level of a first actuality. But there's a nuance here that we need to address. As is well known, Spinoza models his ethics on Euclid's elements. And just as Euclid has his own axioms and lemmas and scholia and corollaries and so on, Spinoza has his own axioms and postulates and propositions and scholia and so on. But where are the constructions? Are there any constructions of Spinoza's own devising to be found in the ethics? And it's a little weird that there aren't any, given that Spinoza emulates so much of what Euclid does. Why doesn't he also offer a construction of his own? He alludes to a construction in Euclid, but does he come up with a construction of his own? I think he does. To make this point, let's go back to the first example I gave you of a construction. Constructing an equilateral triangle on a finite straight line. So as you recall, the way you do this is you treat that as the radius of a circle, you draw another circle, and then what do? You add another side to the triangle. And then you add a third side. And notice how easily we say we're adding sides to the triangle, as though we were adding sides to a house, right? It would be very natural, for example, to hear in a geometry classroom the following words. We created a triangle. We started with one side, then we added a second side to the triangle, and then it was 2/3 complete. And finally, we completed the triangle by adding a third side. And this way of speaking drove Plato crazy. And in the Republic, Plato, speaking through the mouth of Socrates, says, geometers have a ridiculous way of speaking. They talk of adding to shapes and so on, even though their theories are about eternal things, not changeable things that come into existence. So this frustrated Plato. However, Plato's followers came up with a way of rescuing the way that geometers talk and explaining what's going on here. And so an early Platonist, Speusippus, who's pictured here, held the following view. Constructions depict the eternal as if it were temporal. Constructions take an eternal thing and describe it as though it were temporal. When we're constructing, we talk about eternal things as though they were temporal. We talk about changing them and adding to them and so on. And we even depict them as though they were coming into existence, right? When we draw on the page, we're making it look as though a triangle is being born and coming into existence. But all of this is just a manner of speaking, and it shouldn't be taken literally. So here is how Proclus describes the early Platonist view. This isn't Proclus's opinion, it's an early Platonist opinion. Eternal things do not arise. All such things already exist. We look on our constructions of them, not as making them, but as understanding them, taking eternal things as if they were coming to be. So in other words, when we construct a triangle, the triangle is already perfect. It already has 3 sides. When we, quote unquote, add sides one by one to the triangle, we're pretending. We're speaking as though this eternal thing were temporal. But the triangle eternally has the 3 sides that we pretend to add to it. And Aristotle also tells us that the early Platonists held the following view. He's saying more or less what Proclus says, but he just puts a different spin on it. He says that according to these early Platonists, the world itself is eternal, but we sometimes talk about it as though it were created in time, as Plato does in the Timaeus. They say, this is Aristotle speaking, they say that when they talk about the beginning of the world, they're doing what geometers do when they're constructing shapes. They don't mean that the universe really has a beginning. Instead, for teaching purposes, they are facilitating understanding by showing the object like the figure as in the course of formation. I think that these passages, these descriptions of this early Platonist philosophy of geometry can help us understand what we encounter in part 5 of the Ethics. In part 5, Spinoza famously talks to us about love of God. And he says that the intellect, an eternal thing, loves God. And on the face of it, this is a strange thing to say, because for Spinoza, love happens when you know that somebody makes you more complete. So by definition, eternal things cannot be in love. They cannot have any kind of love. They're already complete. They can't become more complete. No one can make them more complete. And so if you're an eternal thing, you could never love. Nevertheless, Spinoza says that they do love. And he puts it in the following way. Although we are already certain that the mind is eternal, nevertheless, for an easier explanation and better understanding of the things we wish to show, we shall consider the eternal mind as if it were now coming to be. And because we're now going to be talking about the mind as though it were coming into existence, we're allowed to say that it's becoming more perfect. And that means we're allowed to say that it loves. A little later, he puts it this way. He says, we're pretending that the mind is temporal. It's really eternal, but we're pretending that it comes into existence. There is no difference between what we are pretending is the case and what is really the case, except that the mind has had eternally the perfections that we are pretending are now being added to it. And I think it's fairly clear what he's alluding to here. On the one hand, he's alluding to this sentence in Aristotle. It's not just in Aristotle, it can be found in other Platonists, but he's alluding to this idea. As Aristotle puts it, for teaching purposes, we facilitate understanding by exhibiting the object like the figure, as in the course of formation. Similarly, Spinoza says, nevertheless, for an easier explanation and better understanding of the mind, we're going to talk about it as though it were coming to be, or we're going to consider it or exhibit it as if it were in formation. And then in the next part of this quotation, I think Spinoza is alluding to a point that Plato makes, that we talk about eternal shapes as though we're adding to them or modifying them, but this is just a manner of speaking. According to the early Platonist theory of shapes, when we construct them, they really have eternally the perfections or properties that we pretend that we're adding to them. So I think it's fairly clear that Spinoza is alluding to this early Platonist conception of construction, and what he's doing in part 5 is effectively giving us a construction of the mind. So all of this, I think, allows us to revisit this question of whether Spinoza is on Aristotle's side or on the side of the Megarians in this debate. And I want to suggest the following. If for Spinoza, my birth is like the moment when I'm constructed, the moment when an eternal thing becomes durational, and if for Spinoza, the early Platonists are right, that a construction gives us a fictional representation of something eternal, wouldn't it follow that my durational existence is a kind of fiction? And in fact, although this sounds like a really out there hypothesis, there are many commentators who have claimed that for Spinoza, eternal existence is real and temporal existence is a kind of fiction. It's not genuinely real. If that is right, then I can be made more actual only by coming to exist in new fictional ways, just as a triangle can become more actual by getting constructed, but then it's not actually changing or in any way genuinely becoming more real because the construction is just a fiction. If that is the case, then in fact, the orthodoxy is correct. And for Spinoza, I cannot be genuinely more actual than I already am. So I think what Spinoza does in the Ethics is he gives us a kind of reconciliation of these two views that were warring back in the time of Aristotle. On the one hand, he agrees with the Megarians that everything possible is already actual. But on the other hand, he agrees with Aristotle that change is the actualization of potentialities. The further point I want to close on is this. Spinoza is often thought of as a great and bold and daring and fearless innovator in philosophy, right? He sets down those definitions and axioms, and then he will relentlessly pursue their conclusions wherever they may lead. And he presents his philosophy as almost a kind of solo act, right? There's not a lot of references to other philosophers in the Ethics. It's almost as though he's presenting his philosophy as though it didn't have a historical context. But what I want to suggest is that, in fact, Spinoza is to a greater degree than is commonly thought. He is certainly an innovator, yes, but I think he's also a systematizer of existing knowledge. Spinoza doesn't mention very many other philosophers by name. There is no bibliography in the Ethics. Nevertheless, I do think that there are what we might call hidden presences of many other philosophers, indeed really a great multitude of them, a crowd of them, and many of them are, it turns out, Aristotelian. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. Here's my email address. Please, if you have any email of any kind, I'd love to hear from you. Doesn't matter if you're new to Spinoza or you've been thinking about Spinoza for a long time. I'd absolutely love to hear from you. So please reach out. And thank you once again so much for being here.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Raffi. Laura? You have a PowerPoint as well?
I do indeed. Okay, excellent. Well, look, before I begin, I want to thank Claudia, Dana, and Dan for their hard work in organizing a seminar of such excellent quality during such uncertain times. I've not joined a live session, so I've missed out on seeing a number of talks and asking questions because of the awful time difference that has meant that our session started a little later today. So thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone who could attend a little later. But the YouTube sessions have been a great intellectual companion during this strange and unprecedented year. Thanks also to Raffi, my co-panelist, for both an interesting and exciting talk, but also for suggesting that we present these ideas together. Now, as I'm sharing my slide deck, I should also say, is my volume okay?
Yes, your volume.
I fear waking the rest of my house and my neighbors, that's all. Let's just queue up. So just as I'm sharing the slide deck, excellent. Let me say it's a great opportunity to present this work titled Geometry and the Art of Thinking. This paper examines some of the underappreciated influences of geometry in the 17th century. On my first and only visit to Bran, the topic of the seminar was something tongue-in-cheek, like losers in the history of philosophy. Oops. Now, that was a formative intellectual experience for me in the early years of my PhD candidature, since it modelled an openness to examining early modern sources that were neglected by the canon and demonstrated the intellectual value of examining underappreciated works. Now, much of my work to date has focused on the nouveaux éléments de géométrie, an underappreciated effort to rewrite the elements of Euclid, published by Antoine Arnauld in 1667. This work, I've argued elsewhere, was written to achieve rich moral, intellectual, and mathematical goals that should be considered part of our efforts to understand mathematical practice in the 17th century. In an era of staggering mathematical developments, we might say it's hardly surprising that scholars have focused their attentions on other, perhaps bolder and more transformative works of mathematics rather than practices of rewriting Euclid's elements. Yet, as I hope to show today, in just a very small way, we ignore these minor works at a cost. Now, in something of a pivot for me, today's talk focuses largely on the logique ou l'art de penser. The logique, as you'll soon hear, was written to cultivate good sense, accuracy and error avoidance, and the capacity for self-understanding. Like the elements, Arnauld and Nicole's logique was written in the mid-1650s with a view to educating judgment and making it as precise as possible. As Arnauld and Nicole tell us in the very first lines of the logique, nothing is more praiseworthy than this. Now, how these prescriptions for thinking well take shape in the logique and how geometry contributes to this process is the subject of this talk. Now, this talk proceeds in three parts. In the first part of the talk, I present the Port-Royalists' definition of thinking and describe their goals in the logique. In so doing, I show that the logique presents an expansive view of what is involved in an art of thinking. We will also see that art in this context means more than a set of rules for reasoning. An art of thinking, I will show, involves learning rules, forming dispositions, and engaging in practice that seeks moral as well as intellectual ends. Beyond simply knowledge acquisition, the Port-Royalists aim for transformation in their students, and this transformation is moral and epistemic. Now, this is an interesting idea in itself, but also important for what I go on to say about the contribution of geometry to the art of thinking. Now, in the second part of the talk, I describe Arnaud and Nicole's reforms of the logic curriculum. In short, I describe their critique of the rules of reasoning in order to foreground the operations of thinking that become their focus in the logique. This contributes to the overall architecture of the talk because, as we'll see in part 3, a number of lessons from geometry inform these newly emphasized aspects of the logic curriculum. In the third part of the talk, I outline some of the aspects of the logique that are influenced by geometry. I then offer a detailed account of one of these lessons, namely Arnaud and Nicole's theory of definition. In the course of so doing, I show that the practice of definition drawn from geometry is central to the operations of conceiving and ordering. To conclude the talk, I show how this evidence of geometry's influence on the logique is to be understood in the context of the Port-Royalists' goals in presenting an art of thinking. Geometry, I'll have argued, played a role in shaping the logic curriculum at Port-Royal, and its practice, the final step in this pedagogical process, completes this intellectual transformation. Through practice, the student of geometry underscores the lessons, dispositions, and values that are given theoretical expression in the logique. Together, these three parts go some way to demonstrating that the Port-Royalists' prescriptions for thinking well in the logique were informed by geometry. So before moving on to the substantive part of the talk, I wanted to briefly state the positioning of the paper. There's so little one can do in 20 to 30 minutes. So I thought it's worth showing what I don't intend to deal with in the context of this paper. Influenced by scholarly trends, the PortRoyal Logic has received sustained attention from early modern grammarians who've mapped the influence of Arnaud and Nicole's general and rational grammar. Yet comparatively little work has been undertaken on the influence of the nouveaux éléments de géométrie on the logique. In my view, this is both important to understanding the logique and understudied. So what I won't be able to do in the context of this talk is describe the scholarship that has gone some way to discussing this theme. Now, for my second pre-talk disclaimer, in a talk of such brevity, it's impossible to address other early modern figures who wrote on this topic or scholarship on how mathematics influenced accounts of what it meant to reason well. What makes the Port-Royalists worthy of our sole attention, I think, is that their logique and geometry can form a coherent pedagogical program focused on cultivating an art of thinking. In this, I think, the Port-Royalists went further than most early moderns who discuss mathematics' contribution to reasoning well, and for this reason deserve our attention. Okay, so let's begin. Arnaud and Nicole's project in the logique is to set out the strategies necessary for having sound ideas as well as judgments and inferences. To this end, the logique treats the four operations of the mind, namely conceiving, judging, reasoning, and ordering, and describes their contributions to the process of conducting reason. These operations, taken together, are to be called thinking. While this might seem trivial, Arnaud and Nicole vehemently defend their use of the term thinking rather than reasoning in their preface to the second edition. Central to this defense is their claim that thinking encapsulates conceiving, judging, and ordering a broader set of mental operations than is characterized by the term reasoning. This emphasis away from reasoning, we'll see shortly, is central to my argument about the importance of geometry to the logique. Having said something about what thinking entails, it seems worth bringing together Arnaud and Nicole's various statements about what's involved in cultivating an art of thinking. Cultivating the art of thinking required exercise and training, and their logic textbook provided useful rules for conducting oneself so as to make the search for truth easier and surer. These were not merely rules for application, but also recommendations that were envisaged by Arnaud and Nicole to aid in self-reflection. As they put it, by reflecting on their thoughts, people can notice which method they use when they are reasoning well, and which was the cause of error when they were mistaken. Cultivating an art of thinking, then, involved learning and assimilating rules, engaging in self-reflection about their use, and developing good habits and appropriate dispositions, such as loving the truth, to ensure their ongoing use. The student would achieve all this through training and exercise. In short, the PortRoyalists presented lessons and opportunities for habit formation, the goal of which was transformational. Now, Arnaud and Nicole describe the art of thinking in their introduction to the Logique. What emerges is a set of claims about the qualities of a person who is epistemically virtuous. These qualities include good sense, mental acuteness, correct and exacting reason, precise judgment, justice, fairness, and judiciousness in speech, and the ability to discern truth from falsity. Cultivating this art of thinking helps us to use reason well, teaches us the source of our errors, and familiarizes us with the nature of the mind by asking us to reflect on its actions. This self-understanding, the PortRoyalists write, is both an excellence in itself and an important preliminary to communicating effectively with others. Failure to do so results in the inability to discern truth from falsity, causes an obstinacy about erroneous judgments, and a failure to distinguish between various statements. Reasons, too, loom large in Arnaud and Nicole's account of thinking poorly. Individuals who have poorly cultivated common sense, little love of the truth, and fail to educate their judgment, appeal to wrong reasons, are unconvinced by sound reasons, or show a steadfast attachment to claims based on no reasons at all. These views receive their clearest articulation in the first line of the preface. Here, Arnaud and Nicole write that nothing is more praiseworthy than good sense and mental accuracy in discerning the true and the false. Practical ends were a key concern for Arnaud and Nicole. The first discourse of the Logique begins with a description of the proper end of intellectual inquiry, both in logic and more generally. Geometry, astronomy, or physics are improper vocations for the virtuous person, since they are, and I quote, completely worthless considered in and for themselves. An intense study of these sciences results in nothing but idle amusement and yields nothing but trivial knowledge. Yet, in Arnaud and Nicole's view, precisely these sciences provided valuable context for improving judgment, ordering thoughts, and exercising the mind. As they put it, we use reason as an instrument for acquiring scientific knowledge when, on the contrary, we should use the sciences as an instrument for perfecting reason. Clearly, Arnaud and Nicole saw the value of these sciences in terms of their ability to cultivate the mind. But intellectual cultivation sought a further goal. On their view, intellectual cultivation was a crucial preliminary to satisfying our obligations as moral agents. Training and exercises provided in works of logic and mathematics are valuable to satisfying, I quote, an individual's obligations to be just, fair, and judicious in all their speech, their actions, and the business they conduct. Cognitive errors, including those described above, I quote, cause not only scientific errors, but also the majority of mistakes committed in civil life. Unjust quarrels, ill-founded lawsuits, hasty opinions, and badly organized enterprises have their source in some error or mistaken judgment, so that there is no fault we are more interested in correcting. Now, the PortRoyalists therefore sought moral and intellectual ends for their textbook that presented lessons on thinking well across the four operations of the mind. The Logique was written to train the mind to seek and love truth and avoid error, make sound judgments and inferences, and deliberate on the basis of solid reasons and order our thoughts well. As I said, the first part of the talk would focus on the Port-Royalists' goals in the Logique. In the second part of the talk, I show that in order to achieve these goals, Arnaud and Nicole believed a transformation in the treatment of logic was required. Now, in the Logique, Arnaud and Nicole set out a program for intellectual cultivation that transforms the traditional logic curriculum. On their view, the lessons of the traditional logic textbook were inadequate to remedying what the Port-Royalists thought were the real reasons for error. In Arnaud and Nicole's view, philosophers hardly ever apply themselves to logic except to give rules of good and bad reasoning. Arnaud and Nicole argue that the rules of reasoning are erroneously treated as if they are central to cultivating an art of thinking. As they put it, it is considered the most important part of logic, and as if it was the only one and is only treated. I'm going to start that again. Philosophers consider the rules of reasoning the most important part of logic, and it's almost the only one that they treat with some care. As a visual representation of this claim, you only need to study the philosophical broadside engraved by Coluccius, which is printed in Susanna Berger's excellent work. The engraving summarizes the principles of Aristotelian logic, and if you can see it, accords reasoning in general and syllogism in particular a dominant role in the edifice of logic. The entire bottom half of this tower of logic is devoted to describing the syllogism, and the syllogism is represented as logic's most powerful arsenal. Yet a great deal changed between 1606 and the mid-1650s, not least because of Descartes' incisive critiques of scholastic logic and the syllogism in particular. At the time of the Port-Royalists' writing, the rules of reasoning, which included the syllogism, became, to quote Arnaud and Nicole, only useful now and then. Okay, so what were these occasional uses that could be made of the rules of reasoning? Arnaud and Nicole identified 5. Firstly, they could be helpful in arranging our thoughts in a more convincing manner. If viewed as speculative truths, the rules of reasoning could constitute useful cognitive exercises. 3, they could reveal flaws in confused arguments. 4, they could help determine the truth and falsity of an argument where we haven't enough evidence merely by appealing to the 2 ideas that compose a proposition. And lastly, and occasionally, they write, quick and discerning thinkers are inattentive and find themselves misled by fallacious inferences. In these cases, reflecting on the rules of reasoning could remedy the unforced errors of inattentive reasoners. Yet even when Arnaud and Nicole acknowledge that the rules of reasoning may be helpful in arranging thoughts or revealing confusions, they are quick to limit their role in a general art of thinking. In their view, the rules of syllogistic reasoning play a minor explanatory role in the process of reasoning and in the majority of errors that individuals make. To take up the second point, our errors are hardly ever the result of errors in the form of reasoning we adopt. Rather, the majority of people's errors depend more on reasoning based on false principles than reasoning incorrectly from principles. In a restatement of this claim, Arnaud and Nicole elsewhere write that most human errors consist in, and I quote, granting false judgments from which mistaken conclusions are inferred. Errors, in their view, are more likely to emerge when people reason with confused and obscure ideas, think with poorly defined terms, and use false principles as a starting point of a demonstration. On Arnaud and Nicole's view, the majority of cognitive errors are therefore errors of thinking, judging, and ordering, rather than errors of reasoning. If we were to offer a visual representation of the transformation of the logic curriculum, in contrast to the image on the previous slide, we'd see a diminution in the importance placed on reasoning, an elevation of conceiving and judging, and an altogether new importance placed on ordering in the PortRoyal Logic. In the second part of the talk, I showed why the Port-Royalists re-evaluated the logic curriculum. In their view, the contemporary logic curriculum failed to address the real reasons for error. Now, in the third part of the talk, I want to outline some of the lessons of conceiving, judging, and ordering that emerge in the Logique and which were influenced by geometry. And there I'll underscore the term outline. What I'll present in outline, I'll then follow in greater detail with how the mathematical practice of definition shaped Arnaud and Nicole's account of ideas and demonstration in the Logique. Oops. So before examining their theory of definitions, I wanted to offer a lightning fast overview of some of the lessons that Arnaud and Nicole tell us are inspired by geometry. According to Arnaud and Nicole, and here I quote them, geometry is virtually the only science that can furnish clear ideas and indisputable propositions. It achieves this, they argue, in the presentation of axioms. According to Arnaud and Nicole's view, geometers go furthest in persuading us of the truth and convincing the mind through the application of the rules of demonstration. The method of demonstration includes rules of definition, axioms and demonstrations, and the methods of geometry, which include ensuring one's proofs are causal, respecting the true order of nature, and avoiding reductio ad absurdum methods. Finally, since one of the key arguments of the paper is that logic involves more than learning and applying rules, it'd be remiss of me not to include Arnaud and Nicole's claim that attentiveness and valuing the truth is imperative to thinking well, that mathematics cultivates attentiveness and the disposition to love the truth is evident in the elements, where Arnaud and Nicole write, "It is very useful and very important to accustom oneself to love the truth, which geometry can train." So here I've very briefly sketched in outline some of the lessons, attitudes, and dispositions that geometry shaped in their work on logic. Now, in what time remains, I'm going to talk through the practice of definition that's attributed to geometers and articulate how it informs the operations of conceiving and ordering in the Logique. In the Logique, Arnaud and Nicole tell us that the practice of ensuring terms contain no ambiguity is employed by geometers. Geometers persuade us of the truth and convince the mind because they observe the following rules. They define all of the terms they use and only use perfectly known terms in their definitions. These eliminate disagreements that are merely terminological and ground demonstration on firm and incontestable principles. Oops, there we go. On Arnaud and Nicole's view, the theory of definition is important to the first part of the Logique, which is devoted to explaining the formation of ideas or conceiving. In this part of the Logique, Arnaud and Nicole explain the nature of ideas and how they originate, how ideas are related to objects, how words express ideas, and how we might avoid confusion in our ideas. According to Arnaud and Nicole, one major source of error emerges when we need to express ourselves to others through words. Our interlocutors, think Arnaud and Nicole, pay greater attention to the words we use than the things to which our terms refer. Now, this is a source of confusion because we often use the same words to refer to different ideas. Put differently, two interlocutors could have two very different ideas in their minds when they're discussing something, but fail to recognize this confusion because they use the same word to describe it. To use Arnaud and Nicole's example, two people could be talking about souls and yet have two radically different conceptions of it in their minds. Our failure to appreciate this difference, they think, is a common source of confusion. To remedy this error that is born of making use of words to signify our thoughts, Arnaud and Nicole recommend a practice of defining our nouns. The practice of defining our terms is called nominal definition. What it consists in is offering our interlocutor a clear understanding of what we mean when we use a term. We make ourselves, I quote, clearly understood in order to avoid useless disputes over words that one person understands one way and another in another way, as so often happens in ordinary speech. For Arnaud and Nicole, the practice of offering nominal definitions focuses our attention on the ideas we have rather than the words we use to communicate them. This is the role of definition in the mental operation of conceiving. Now, the practice of definition is also central to ordering our thoughts in the process of demonstration. By grounding all demonstrations on nominal definitions, we can avoid errors of ambiguity associated with equivocal terms and persuade ourselves and others through the conclusions that we draw. Definition is, therefore, both central to the habit of thinking well and a prerequisite for scientific demonstration. And its emphasis on nominal definition as a route for avoiding errors in our thoughts is first. Okay. Arno and Nicole's emphasis on nominal definition is a route for avoiding errors in our thoughts. They serve as first principles in a practice of ordering our thoughts and capture how we can convince others through demonstration. Now, this is a practice that's drawn from geometry. According to Arno and Nicole, geometers use nominal definitions frequently. In fact, Arno and Nicole's Arno's Nouveaux Éléments de Géométrie proceeds exclusively from nominal definitions which serve as first principles. For Arno and Nicole, the clarity that's introduced through definition and exemplified in the practices of geometry eliminates equivocation and ensures demonstrative certainty that's worth emulating in our habits of thinking. In this way, geometry contributed to strategies aimed at understanding the operations of conceiving and ordering. Now, in order to make the final point of my talk at the practical value of mathematics, I'm going to stay with definition. Now, to make the point, I'll need to remind you that in part 1, I argued that the lessons of logic required practice and training. If we examine Arno's comments in the Nouveaux Éléments, we see Arno telling the reader that his geometry completes an intellectual transformation that begins with lessons in logic. In the Nouveaux Éléments, Arno writes that the logique presents a number of rules for avoiding confusion. Knowing these rules, however, doesn't indemnify us from making errors because, as he writes, we don't always make the effort to apply these rules we've learned. Geometry accustoms the mind to put the rules of logic into practice, including by being on guard against terms that have equivocal meanings. Now, in this brief section, I've given some evidence that geometry, and the Nouveaux Éléments in particular, informed the lessons of the logique and provided a context for training and exercising the mind. In this way, the Nouveaux Éléments is a practical corollary of its more famous theoretical treatise, the Logique. So in conclusion, I've argued in this talk that the goal of the Logique was to cultivate good sense, accuracy and error avoidance, and the capacity for self-understanding. To do so, the Port-Royalists presented rules for thinking well and sought to shape the habits and dispositions of their readers. In the rules they taught, the dispositions they nurtured, and the habits they cultivated, Arno and Nicole drew on the Nouveaux Éléments de Géométrie. Mathematics, to repeat the example of definition, inspired rules for defining terms to avoid ambiguity, focused the mind on ideas rather than terms, and presented examples of certain and persuasive demonstrations. In so doing, geometry contributed to lessons and strategies for error avoidance that Arno and Nicole argued were central to an art of thinking in general and the operations of conceiving and ordering in particular. These lessons emerged at a time when the rules of reasoning received vehement and sustained critique. For Arno and Nicole, mathematics was exemplary, while the rules of reasoning were harmful, and in that I quote them. Geometry provided what the rules of reasoning obscured, the true source of cognitive error. According to the authors of the Logique, geometry is both a model for thinking well and a context for training the mind. And with that, I conclude. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. We can open the discussion now, and you can indicate that you would like to ask a question by sending a brief note on the chat or by raising your hand. Okay, the first hand that I saw was, I think, J.B. Shank. JB, are you there? Or did I make a mistake? Let me ask a question of Raffi to begin. You talk about, you said at one point that after death, I continue to exist as a first actuality in God. That would seem to entail that when I exist temporally, I'm a second actuality in God. Is that right, Raffi?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And this is, I take it, supposed to clarify the relationship between existing in eternity and existing temporally. And that, of course, is one of the, as you well know, one of the central problems in Spinoza, in Spinoza's philosophy, is the relationship between temporal existence and eternal existence, and how it is that the two of them are related. What I'm wondering is, does that really explain that? How do I go from atemporal, eternal existence? How does one pass from atemporal, eternal existence to the temporal existence? And does appealing to Aristotle there really help us understand that?
It's such a huge question, and it's a very useful question. I think maybe this answers at least part of the question. For Spinoza, what characterizes you as the mode that you are is a certain ratio of motion and rest, which I take to be a kind of quasi-geometrical thing. It's some kind of ratio or pattern that characterizes you as what you are. And when you were born, it is as though that particular geometrical object was constructed. It was brought from eternal existence into this other kind of existence, durational existence. Now, I'm not being very careful here because actually temporality and duration for Spinoza are different, and that's an issue I really elided. But Spinoza seems to want us to understand birth on the model of geometrical construction. Now, how exactly this happens? Well, some other finite mode needs to actualize you. So your parents conceived you. They actualized this particular mode. Now, they themselves on this reading are also, if we're focusing on their durational being, they themselves are like the shape-shifting objects that geometers draw on pieces of paper. They are temporal manifestations of eternal things. To fully answer your question, I think we'd have to read the whole ethics, but maybe this is at least the beginning of an answer.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Vincenzo.
Yes, so thank you very much for both talk. I liked them very much. I have two questions, in fact, but I will begin with the one for Raphael. So my question is this: you mentioned very rightly, I mean, the conception that geometrical objects are drawn in primary matter, in some sense, in the Aristotelian tradition. Of course, the exact way in which this was done changed very much throughout the centuries, and in particular, when you have an Aristotelian or Proclean conception of primary matter, you have that in fact you are constructing geometrical objects out of nothing, in a sense, because primary matter has no determinations at all. Nonetheless, in the following tradition, this primary matter was more and more characterized as something which is already extended, already quantified, and so on, so that you get in the end at the idea that you are drawing figures not out of nothing, but really on a blackboard of sorts, which is the original extension. This can be found in some sense already in Thomas Aquinas with the Materia Signata Quantitate, more and more in the Jesuit commentaries of the 16th and 17th century. And of course, when you get to Descartes, this extended matter is just completely actual, that is extension. And in Spinoza should be something like God himself, or as regarded under the attribute of extension. So my general question would be, taking the cue from this, there is something like an actuality which need already to be there in order to actualize further potentialities in Spinoza. That is the existence in eternity of extension may be seen in the case of mathematical object as the existence in time of geometrical figure. And is this something that you may bring to other ways of explaining what is happening in Spinoza's metaphysics?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really, really appreciate your question. And I've been enjoying your work on this topic as well. So it's an honor to have you here. I think that you've helped me perhaps solve a bit of a problem, which is that I wasn't quite sure where pure potentiality went in Spinoza's account because it's not there. And I think maybe you're giving me the answer here. It's that really there was a revision of this notion of prime matter. And so when Spinoza says that, fundamentally there's just extension, which isn't grounded in anything more fundamental, or it's not the realization of something. Perhaps he's just reflecting this Thomistic or post-Thomistic tradition of or revision to the Aristotelian account. So thank you. If I've understood you correctly, I think that is very helpful.
Jack Stetter.
Thanks a lot. Thank you both very much for your talks. I have a time issue, I'm sorry, so I'll have to keep myself brief for a change, but I would have more to say. Very interesting. So I'm going to ask my questions for Raffi though, because we were kind of talking about this. So you talked about the kind of existence enjoyed by eternal beings, and I don't know about that because all beings. This is what I want you to respond to. First of all beings conceived adequately are eternal, right? That's kind of what I understand to be what Spinoza says, for example, in 2p44, right? To reason is to think of things as necessary, that is eternal. Okay, but it's also just, project of the ethics. So want to hear what you think about that. And then, so I was just kind of bothered by this sort of eternal beings talk, okay. And conceiving of being durationally would be conceiving it inadequately, right? That's the sort of counterpart of that. And then this is kind of going back to what Dan mentioned. I wanted to follow up on that. You referred to passing away, or I think, as returning to the first actuality, but I might not have understood you. I think that's what you were saying. So you could clarify that. I don't know. It just seemed to me like the lesson of the passage you quoted, 2p8 corollary and scholium, is that the mode's essences are always contained in the attributes, insofar as they exist as essences, right? So we're always enjoying this first kind of actuality, even if we don't know it. Okay, so those are my two kind of remarks and questions. I'd love to hear what you think. And both of you, thank you very much for your talks.
Thank you so much, Jack. So let me first say that your question touches on issues that I think it's very healthy and very good that Spinoza scholars disagree about these issues. Like I in no way want to say, oh, my interpretation needs to include the others, and that's not what it's about. I'd much prefer to have multiple Spinozas. We just got a lot more bang for our buck this way. So look, at the end of the day, maybe we just read Spinoza differently. I think though, okay, all I can say is, look, here are some passages that inspire me to my interpretation. So Spinoza does say that it does say in 2p8, I think in the corollary and also in the scholium, he says that there's a certain that let me see if I can get this right. He's talking about the ideas of non-existing particular things, or non-existing singular things, and he says that when things actually exist, then our ideas of them involve the existence through which they are said to have duration. Now, that phrase there, the existence through which they're said to have duration, sounds like a rather wordy way of saying durational existence. Right? There's a particular kind of existence, which he also calls duration or perseverance. And throughout the ethics, he seems to be adopting this double aspect view on which existence can be conceived either durationally or eternally. So that's why I think I'm entitled to see in Spinoza's ontology such a thing as durational existence. But many people have pointed out that it's very hard for Spinoza to keep durational existence once he introduces it into his ontology, because you're absolutely right. In Proposition 44, he says that basically God doesn't see any durational existence. God doesn't see any, nor does God see any temporal existence. So it's very tempting to say that, you know, there's really no room in the ontology for this, and it has to somehow fall out. So, and I don't think so. I think Spinoza has to go to a very weird view where he basically thinks that there's this vantage point of imagination, which is in some sense contained within itself. But basically, I think Joachim, you know, about 120 years ago, pointed out that Spinoza is committed to these kinds of existence, those durational beings and temporal beings. But on the other hand, he also seems committed to the view that they are in some sense fictional. And part of what makes Spinoza fascinating is we've got this interpretive challenge. How do we make sense of his commitment to these apparently fictional existence? I mean, for goodness sake, even the imagination on Spinoza's theory, the imagination, which is meant to be the thing that perceives durational being, well, that imagination is also a durational being. So, you know, is the imagination a kind of fiction that is contained within itself? Is that even a coherent idea? This is part of what I'm really interested in when it comes to making sense of this kind of problem. So thank you. And I know you've got to run. Thank you so much for your question. Yeah.
Dennis actually has a comment on that. Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Raffi. So I want to bring to your attention some other passages which are relevant to what you were discussing with Jackson. So in Scholium to Proposition 45, Part 2, this begins, by existence here, I do not understand duration, that is, existence insofar as it is conceived abstractly, and as a certain species of eternity, quantity, I'm sorry. For I'm speaking of the very nature of existence, which is attributed to singular things, because infinitely many things follow from eternal necessity of God's nature, infinite many works. And that's 1p16 that he's referring to there, and then he does it explicitly. Mm-hmm. Now, existence, the very nature of existence is eternal. It appears in this passage. So duration is somehow understood abstractly. He doesn't elaborate what that really comes to here. But the relation between first actuality and second actuality in someone like Aristotle or the scholastics is not the relation of the very nature of existence, which is eternal, and the durational existence in Spinoza. So it's full existence when you come to second actuality in Aristotle, unless I'm not very well known, knowledgeable in Aristotle, but it's only when you can speak. When you speak in French, that's the full actuality. Prior to that, there was an incomplete actuality. So there is no movement from incomplete to complete here in Spinoza. From things considered to be in God, following from God's existence, as in Proposition 16, Part 1, they can be considered eternally, and that's the very nature of existence. So considering the relation of that to durational existence is not one of completion, but is one of abstraction. And that's a very different issue, it appears. And I don't want to get too long. There are many other questions that I have, but I'll just stop here.
Thank you. That's a very, very good point. Yeah, so I agree. So I think 2p45 Scholium at least supports my view that duration is a kind of existence, or it's an aspect of existence, right? Existence can be conceived either as duration or as eternity. And you know, I mean, I think, yeah, strictly speaking, this is a double aspect view. So it may be a little misleading to speak of different kinds of existence, but I think Spinoza allows himself to speak of different kinds. But you make a really, really good point about how it can't be the case that Aristotle's notion of second actuality has simply been copied over into Spinoza's ontology, because there is a huge difference. And it's, I mean, I agree with you, and I think you've already, in your question, you've helped me get a clearer understanding of it. What I would say is that Spinoza seems to be blending both an Aristotelian account of geometrical construction with this early Platonist idea that a construction actually doesn't in any way change the object, the eternal object. Instead, a construction introduces a sort of fictional version of this object. So that is a huge difference between Spinoza's view and Aristotle's view. I don't think in any way that for Aristotle, when an eternal thing becomes temporal or durational, that it's somehow assuming some kind of fictional existence. But that Platonist view seems to have made its way into the ethics as well.
Okay. Ariana Schneck.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, thanks to both of you for two really cool talks. I very much enjoyed them. And I have a question that is actually a question for kind of both of you. I will start with Raffi's part of my question. And I was wondering about the role of love, because you, as I don't know if I completely understood you correctly, but you framed a kind of like problem for Spinoza, consisting in that love happens when you find something that makes you more complete. But when you're already eternal, perfect, etc., you are already complete. So how can you love someone or something? And then, and here I'm not completely sure whether I understood you correctly, but you said something like the ancient thinkers, like when you take their perspective in, then you get something like from our perspective, we see things as if they had, for example, a beginning or are in time or are not eternal or not perfect. But you were talking about a fictional representation here. So the question would be, what are the implications of this model for love? Like, is it merely fictional, or is it merely like based upon a fiction? And then I also have a Laura part of that question, because you were also talking briefly about the role of love of truth in the PortRoyal thinkers. And yeah, here I was just curious to hear about more, yeah, what they think love is, or like what love of truth exactly is, and whether you see a connection to what Raffi said. So do you think that they also think that it makes us in some sense more complete or more perfect, maybe by helping us to improve our thinking or acquire more knowledge? Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana. This is a really, really good question. There's a translation problem that I think is connected with your question, and it's the question of how to translate. I think it's part 5, proposition 31, Scholium. So Spinoza there says, although we are already certain that the mind is eternal, insofar as it understands things under the aspect of eternity, still, for an easier explanation and better understanding of the things we're going to talk about, we shall consider it as if it were, we shall consider it as if it were coming to be, or we shall consider it as if it were beginning to be. And then he adds the following words, as we have done up to this point. Now, in Curley's translation, it comes out like this. We shall consider the mind as if it were beginning to be, and we're beginning to understand things under the aspect of eternity, as we have done up to this point. And that's a rather deflationary translation, and it makes it seem as though those words don't really add very much. It makes it seem as though all he's saying is that we're going to consider the mind as though we're progressing towards this state of understanding that we've been taking it to have for a while. But George Eliot, in the very first translation of the Ethics into English, notices that actually this is, like, she notices that, basically, Curley's translation is actually incorrect. It grammatically doesn't work. Eliot's translation is more accurate, but Eliot's translation makes Spinoza's view seem very strange. In Eliot's translation, Spinoza says the following: we shall consider the mind as if it were beginning to be, as we have done up to this point. In other words, what we've been doing for a while is considering the mind as if it were temporal. Now, it would follow from this translation that for Spinoza, whenever we're thinking about temporal things, we are fictionally construing eternal things in temporal form. But it's true that much of the ethics is a kind of fiction. And maybe it's sort of appropriate that it took somebody like George Eliot to notice this. And Ed Curley's translation sort of excludes this reading. So yeah, I think it's entirely possible. I mean, I have to look in more into this. And it's entirely possible that Spinoza is committed to the view that temporal stuff, changing stuff, is in some sense a fiction. It's not to denigrate it or say that we should stop believing it or anything like that. It's just to say that the standpoint of the imagination is a kind of fiction, analogous to the fiction that arises when we construe eternal shapes in temporal form when we're reading Euclid's Elements. Thanks for your question.
Hi, Ariana. That was such an interesting question, and it was really interesting to see you bring together Raffi and my talk. To just repeat the question as it was directed to me, I think I heard you ask, what is the role of love in the way that the PortRoyalists are thinking about logic and geometry, and what role does it play? And in the talk, as I described it, love has a motivational force. It's part of why we shape ourselves in a particular kind of way in response to the logic. It helps us to think better. I think Arnaud and Nicole in the Logique say that these lessons are inert unless we have the right kind of dispositions to them. Now, one of the things that I wanted to draw out in this talk is that cultivating this love of truth takes place not in the logic, but in geometry, where we're exposed to a practice that cultivates that disposition. So it's through the process of demonstration that we have this experience of the truth. And we love it for its clarity and its persuasiveness and so on. Now, it's interesting, it took me a while to notice that in the PortRoyalists, in part because they speak so critically of the passions. And yet, they say that, in fact, geometry is a practice that we undertake in order to diminish the passions. And yet, loving the truth is instrumental to thinking well on their view, because it provides the motivation to learn to think well. And geometry is obviously its practice. What's interesting is that in the preface to the Nouveaux Éléments de Géométrie, we see a number of terms like love. So for instance, they say that we learn to love the truth. We admire the beauty of geometry, and through that experience, we cultivate this art of thinking. So it's easy to miss in their work, particularly because of their criticism of the passions, and yet loving the truth is that disposition that's cultivated in geometry that's a corollary to the theoretical lessons that emerge in the logic.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Caterina Peixoto. Caterina?
Hi, I made a question. I have a problem with my dog now. I made a question. I wrote it. It's there on the chat.
Would you like me to read it?
Oh,
yes. Thank you. Hi, Laura.
The question is, I'd like to know how you would answer these two questions. One, why the fourth part of the LAP?
LAP, logic or the art of thinking.
Logic.
Logique ou l'art de penser.
Yeah, is not in the first part. I mean, I wonder if this would be a mere historical pedagogical fact and not a programmatic decision, say a methodological requirement. And two, why the teaching of geometry is not present as such, at least in the first part. Also, willing to know your thoughts on the relation between science and logic, according to the authors, as they established in the first discourse. What should be the place of geometry as an art of thinking? Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Katerina. I'm going to take those questions in reverse order, if that's okay. So geometry is an example of a science that can cultivate the mind. I remember one of the things that Arnaud and Nicole write in the Logique is that these sciences are not useful in and of themselves. There is no value in knowing geometry as an end in itself, nor is there value in knowing physics or astronomy or whatever it is that they write about in the first discourse. What its value, the value it presents a student is that it provides a context for exercising the mind. So it so happens, and this is perhaps not the place to get into it, that Arnaud and Nicole don't agree on those ideas. I think Arnaud is far more permissive when it comes to pursuing science as an end in itself, but certainly Nicole, who penned the first discourse, believes that these sciences, he calls them fruitless and sterile, are of no value in and of themselves, but provide an important context for training the mind. And this is the sense in which I presented the Nouveaux éléments de géométrie today. Now, this to my mind is the relationship between science and logic, and captures what I think is the place of geometry in an art of thinking. To summarize that thought, geometry is the practical corollary of the theoretical lessons that we encounter in the Logique or l'art de penser. Your first question is a very interesting one, and it strikes me that it's, as you write, a historical and pedagogical fact that the details that emerge in part 4 to do with method are there for, because this is how works of logic were presented at the time. I'd be interested, if I can ask you a question, why you think that it would make sense to treat the material on ordering in the context of the material on conceiving. So it's just a question for you. What I think is quite interesting, if we just look at the example of definition, Arnaud and Nicole's theory of definition, at least as it emerges in part 4 of the Logique, is by and large drawn from Pascal. Now, the interesting transformation that I think takes place at PortRoyal is that, or at least in the Logique, is that the account of definitions is synthesized into the theory of ideas. Now, it's easy to miss, particularly if we're scholars of Pascal, this transformation in thinking about geometry, not just in the, thinking about definition, not just in the context of method, but also in the context of conceiving. So this, I think, is something that's new, and maybe inspired your question about why these two parts of the Logique aren't treated together. And my sense is that the reason that these are treated separately is that this is the tradition of treating logic textbooks.
Great. Alberto Luis Lopez.
Hi there. Well, thank you both. I enjoy so much your talks, but I have a question for Laura, and it's my question is more focus more on the context or the background of the work, the Logique. If I'm right, the first edition was published in 1662, right? And my question is, probably in the first 2 or 3 decades, in the 17th century, a very important work, a logic, an influential work was the so-called Lógica Mexicana, or the Mexican logic, was written by the Mexican priest, well, Spanish priest in Mexico in 1603. And immediately it was published in France, in Portugal, Germany, Poland, England. And we know, as a matter of fact, that Descartes studied that Rubius logic when he was studied at La Flèche. So my question is, do you know if there is some connection or relation between the logic of Arnaud and Nicole and the Lógica Mexicana? I don't know if there's some reference, positive, negative, a reaction in favor or against or whatever. Just, I'm curious.
Look, that's such an interesting question. And I have more questions for you, hearing about this very interesting work. Arnaud and Nicole, in fact, much like Spinoza, don't say much about where they inherit their ideas. I think you can count the attributions to Pascal and Descartes on a single hand, despite the fact that so much of their work is drawn from these two central figures of early modern philosophy. So I have no sense that they had read this work or encountered it. And I think that provides a really exciting avenue of exploration.
Okay. I honestly, I don't know, but that just probably, I don't know, you can help me, because was, you know, the reason that was very important during probably the first decades was the reason that I was wondering, right? Probably Arnaud and Nicole had some reference or influence, because it was a very influential work in that time. But well, we need to search about it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so interesting. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Domenico?
Hi. I just wanted to say, yeah, first off, thanks to both of you for really, really interesting talks. And yeah, I guess I have short questions for one for Raffi and one for Laura. So I'll just try and get them out there as quickly as possible. My question for Raffi just has to do with how kind of, I think this parallel between the things that you're talking about in Spinoza and some of the Aristotelian views on potentiality and actuality seem very like there's a lot there, and I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to how much of this you think is kind of a Spinoza's reinterpretation of Aristotle, and how much of it you think is Spinoza really trying to faithfully inherit some of these distinctions that you're talking about in Aristotle. So I think in particular, and this is a theme that I think has come up in some of the questions, is this idea that maybe Spinoza is picking up on this Aristotelian idea, but maybe reconceiving it in certain ways. So yeah, I just want to invite you to say a little bit more about that. And then just for Laura, I wanted to, again, invite you to say a little bit more on some of the stuff that you brought up at the end of your talk. So in particular, you talked a little bit about how the Port-Royalist conception of definition played into their understanding of reasoning and geometry. And so I was wondering if you had more to say about what kinds of definitions were going to be important for the Port-Royalists, and whether you saw a kind of parallel to earlier geometrical systems in terms of what kind of definition is being used, and more generally conception about first principles, like what the kind of status of first principles is for the Port-Royalists, and how they're using that conception to refer to early geometrical systems. So I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to put this out there in the shortest, most succinct way possible. But yeah.
Sorry, Raffi, I'll let you go first.
Oh, sure. I don't know. Thanks. Domenica, is a really good question. I think it raises a deep kind of philosophy of history question, which is something like, well, under what conditions would we say that any ideas from any previous thinker had survived into the ethics? I think it's fair to say that in some sense, Spinoza endorses a roughly Aristotelian conception of substance, but there are many differences. He endorses, Carriero in his work has talked about how you can see Spinoza's conception of the substance-mode relation as arising from this Aristotelian tradition, but it's adapted in the process. Of course it is. This is a tricky business, though, because, of course, someone could say, well, there are very stringent identity conditions here, and so if the concept has been changed significantly, it's not the same concept. But I think what I was trying to say was that Spinoza's view can be plausibly reconstructed as an application of the Aristotelian model of actualization to geometrical construction, but with plenty of Platonism also baked in. And my suspicion is, given that Spinoza repeatedly adverts to recognizably Aristotelian terminology, and given that there's a deep similarity in many respects between his view and the Aristotelian view, it was an overstatement for so many commentators to say that Spinoza discards the Aristotelian potentiality actuality distinction. I wouldn't say that he discards it, but he does. I think that he adopts it and he adapts it. Maybe this comes down to some kind of terminological dispute about exactly what it would take for him to be adopting rather than simply replacing the Aristotelian model. But at any rate, I hope to have presented some evidence that he is, in a larger degree than previously recognized, really adopting and adapting rather than chucking out. So thank you for your question. It's very helpful.
Thanks, Raffi. That's helpful.
And to answer your question, I mean, who doesn't love just an invitation to expand on paper? So thank you for that question. So what you invited me to do is to say more about the PortRoyalists' theory of definitions, both how the account that they present slots into a theory of principles, firstly, and secondly, how the account that they present reforms the theory of definition as it emerges in earlier logic works or earlier works of mathematics. So it was impossible to give a sketch of this given the sort of time constraints that I had. But one of the things that emerges in parts 1 and 2 of the Logique is the role of real definition in contrast to nominal definition. So, what are nominal definitions? They define our terms. It's precisely because nothing hinges on these definitions. They merely designate what is meant by a particular term, that they can be used as first principles in a science of demonstration. What cannot be used as a principle is a real definition. And this is because real definitions, in contrast to nominal definitions, are about things. These need to be proved rather than merely stipulated or presented. There's one exception, which is when our knowledge of a thing is so clear and distinct that it requires no definition. Now, in the context of their nouveaux éléments, there is a single real definition, and you'll forgive me, the sun is still rising. I think that the only real definition that they present is a definition of a line. All other definitions in the nouveaux éléments are nominal definitions, and this is a transformation of the practice of offering definitions. So if you look at the nouveaux éléments, you find all terms defined. They define a line, they define an angle, and in a meta moment, they define definition. So at the beginning of the nouveaux éléments, they tell us what an axiom is, what a definition is, and what a demonstration consists in. And this is new to their work. So I believe the Nouveaux Éléments was inspired in part by Taquet's edition of the Elements. And here we see a mix of real and nominal definitions as the starting point of the elements. And this is transformed in their edition. I think what's interesting is the impact of their theory of definition. So we see in a number of works of elementary geometry to follow a reliance on nominal definition. Now, I think this is interesting both in the context of improving our art of thinking, but also in the context of describing how the logique transforms the practice of rewriting the elements of Euclid after the publication of the Nouveaux Éléments. So that's a really interesting question. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. It's really illuminating day. I'd love to hear more, but maybe we can talk at another time about it. But thank you both again for your talk.
I'm afraid that there is no more time. I'm so sorry. This has been a lovely couple of papers. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very